Sarah, you and I are here at this conference, Alternative Concepts of God. You're here as a theist, I'm here confused. Let's go through some of the things we hear and see what we're supposed to believe about these new ideas. Start with pantheism.
By the way, that's not particularly new, and also, can I just niggle about theism?
Sure.
In fact, all these titles are sort of generic abstractions, which is a little odd. When we are trying to choose between these, we're not, strictly speaking, ticking conglomerated boxes. What we really ought to be doing is looking at particular developed versions of each of these and, trying to decide on their coherence and convincingness. So, when you say pantheism, are we talking about John Leslie, or are we talking about Spinoza, or are we talking Advaita Vedanta? Or are we talking like a sort of Wordsworthian
I guess we're talking in the simplest form that the divine, small d maybe, is the physical world, however extant it is, and the physical world is divine. There's no difference. But the physical world is divine. It's not using the word divine to throw away something beyond the physical in some way, some force. I
think this can be an entirely coherent position. I mean, it has a number of very strong philosophical contenders. I myself am not convinced by it for reasons of my prior response to and experience of and transformative interaction with what I take to be the truth of the Christian God.
Which is a personal God.
Which is a personal God.
And the key distinction with pantheism is there's no personal God, and whatever is the divine is not transcendent. Those are the two main characteristics.
Well, and perhaps as an extension of that latter point, even more importantly, within the classic Christian tradition, God is the creator out of nothing.
Yes.
So God is ontologically not just distinct from us, but fundamentally, almost mind-blowingly different from us.
Right.
That which not only created everything in the first place, but sustains and loves it in being every moment. And, of course, once you begin to really understand the tradition of scholastic Christian thought, you see that it shares something with pantheism. The choice between the two is not quite as dramatic as might be seen, because one of the great virtues of pantheism, at its best, is that it sees the whole world shot through with God.
Yes.
But the same can be said of the classical scholastic Christian God, and especially of mystical responses to that God. The difference lies in the perception within the Christian package, if you like, that shot-throughness of the glory of God comes from that without which there would be nothing, as opposed to being strictly identified with the whole.
Let's go on to panentheism, which seems to deal with the problem of pantheism in the limitation of the divine, to allowing the divine, if I can say that, to expand beyond the world. The world is still encased by the divine. It is the divine, but the divine now can be somewhat transcendent from the rest of the world. So panentheism has supposedly all the benefits of pantheism, but allows some of the traditional benefits also of theism by enabling this transcendence as well.
But it also has, for me, a really insuperable paradoxical difficulty, in that it both suggests that the divine has a lure, a direction, and therefore some kind of guarantee that an end is teleologically directed out of it. But also, it seems to me, no guarantee whatever, because if God is subject in some sense to the unfolding nature of the creation, then what is lost is that absolute ontological difference that comes with the creation out of nothing. And it strikes me that the modern panentheists in the Western tradition are, as it were, falsely reacting to a straw man Christian God that exists more in their own mind than in reality. So actually I'm not certain that you can't have all the benefits that panentheism seeks if you rightly understand the classic God. That's where I would stand anyway.
Another view is actually quite different. It almost is neutral on whether there's a God. There may be a God, may be not a God, but what is ultimately fundamental, what has caused all reality, is a principle, a value of the good that maybe traces its way back to Plato. And perhaps because there is the good, that God somehow was generated from that good, and maybe all the things thereafter that we think of God happened. But at the ultimate bedrock of reality is value and the good.
Well, I think that's a very attractive moral position. But I say that as someone who is a Christian with a form of Christianity strongly flavoured by Platonism already, and of course that's what conjoins the two positions. I think what I find slightly weird about such a position is that I can't understand, for instance, in Leslie's form of it, quite under what conditions he is persuaded of it. Is it evidences? Is it coherence? Is it, I think it is, a sort of aesthetic intuitionism. That's a point to have a conversation. I'm also puzzled by it because it seems to have nothing of the virtues of a religiously embedded tradition where those...
They may look upon that as a virtue, not as a liability.
Because I suspect for him, individualism and autonomy has a stronger virtue than being part of a tribe, to put it negatively. But of course, I don't think that the church is a tribe at its best. It can behave badly in that way, but at its best, it's a mystical body. And oddly, I think Leslie's form of moral intuitionism seeks something of that mystical body quality, precisely in its notion of how infinite minds interact with each other.
I think infinite minds are a derivative of the fundamental concept that say, if there is a good, what are some of the consequences? And he takes it, granted, rather far. But looking at its most fundamental level, the question is, and I put this to you, would it disturb your Christianity if your Christian God had as its foundation the good, and that good, which was the ultimate value, generated in some sense the Christian God? Would that bother you?
It's a very strange way of putting a metaphysical option for a Christian, I think, because it suggests that there's something more fundamental than God.
Yes,
and whereas
that's exactly the point.
Whereas by definition, that without which there would be nothing else is God for me. Therefore, I sort of beg the question back to you. In other words, it wouldn't bother me that there is a good which is the fundamental force in the universe. I would just call it God. That I would then go on to say, and he has a son and a spirit.
Well, yeah, but if you call it God, then you're denaturing your concept of God, because then it's not personal. Remember, he's having the good is creating God. God is an expression of the good. Good is not a core characteristic of God.
Sure. Okay, so that's why this is a sort of false disjunction for me. By definition, for me, God is personal and is the ultimate source of goodness. So obviously, I would want to argue with him about the personal nature of that fundamental creative force.
Again, his fundamental force would be, which is impersonal, generates potentially the God who is personal.
Well, that's
does that difference bother you?
It certainly does, yes, because that is a sort of Platonic emanationism in which God appears at a secondary and lower level from the fundamental being, or perhaps being is the fundamental form of the good, I think. So I think that's a vital difference. Is the ultimate reality personal or not? That's a kind of choice we have to make metaphysically. What's really interesting at the moment is that the sources of discussion in philosophy, especially analytic philosophy, are undergoing enormous transformation. Perhaps we could say this starts with David Lewis's speculation about other worlds, because suddenly it's all right to have an enormous variety of different visions of God. Whereas, you know, under the shadow of logical positivism in the 50s and onwards, even though logical positivism in the kind of air-type form was seen off fairly quickly, nonetheless its shadow hung around. And the choice was between God or atheism. And now we have this huge set of possible speculative options set before us. And we've slightly forgotten how to adjudicate. And I think that's a changed scenario, which is actually very exciting for people who all along have actually believed in something called God. But it's also an unusual discourse for us, because we're not used to this huge variety of gods that are currently being paraded out.
And to speculate about God then enriches the concept. So we sort of have permission now to think a little bit grander, if totally speculative.
Of course, it's just a matter of fashion. I mean, if you look at the history of philosophy, such a range of speculations in the ancient world was the standard state of affairs. But we have to construct a new discourse now in order to show how we can rationally adjudicate between these myriad options.